Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. How are you today? Is everyone doing well? Are you having a good week? It's the peak of the week. It's been a busy day for me, but as always, very happy to be with you and looking forward to our conversation. Hello, Alondra. Good to see you. Hope your day is well too. I'm aware that many of you are probably a little tired and the semester's beginning to pick up. Some of you maybe have had assignments already. Some of you are probably studying for exams. We will have more information about our exam, our midterm in here, and we'll talk about that more in the next couple weeks. I do plan on giving you a study guide that should be useful in preparing you. But of course, that will be up to you to complete. And as long as you prepare for the exam by reviewing the reading that you've done and the lectures, you should be in a good position. But I do leave it up to you, of course, to make the most of the study guide and to prepare in a way that is useful for you. Let me close the door here and I'll be with you in just a moment. Working from home is always interesting because, yeah, I kind of thought today, like, we've been doing this for like a year and a half, like a year now, but it just seems normal now. And I don't know if that's good or bad. But anyway, we're here and it's one way for us to get together. So let's get started discussing the question of the secret ballot and voting secrecy. Just a minute here. So we're talking about the influence of elites, and we're talking about the way that we vote and the process of voting and the secrecy or lack thereof of voting. And, this is one of those things that we think about, and it may seem sort of unimportant at first, secret voting. What's the big deal? It's just one of those institutional features of the voting process that doesn't really have any relevance to the outcome. But as you saw on Monday, secret voting is really quite important because it protects voters from intimidation and bribery, and it frees them from the influence, in particular, of landlords and employers and powerful actors who might control and supply their votes to parties or political elites in exchange for money or favors or policies. These are some pretty unseemly relationships, and they get us thinking about the influence that your employer has or your landlord has. And last class, virtually all of us agreed that it's quite scary, the prospect of your employer or your landlord knowing who you voted for and potentially penalizing you or punishing you for who you voted for. So, in this regard, secret voting is really quite important because it separates us from those elites who might try to control our votes and exchange them for favors or policies. And it's what ensures our individual freedom, and so that we're not voting in the interest of our landlord or employer, but in our own interest. And so then we think of images like this. The sign says the vote is free and secret. And this is an image from Latin America or the Caribbean somewhere. I don't know exactly which country. It comes from an article in the AP that I tracked down and did some reading of in preparation for this lecture. But the point that this image is making and that comes out of our lecture on Monday is that the vote is only free when it is secret. If it's not secret, it may not be free because it opens us up to intimidation or bribery or the kinds of coercion that that really we associate with the pre secret ballot days. Now, this is a topic that actually is quite relevant to a lot of the discussion right now in the United States. Remember that Donald Trump was tried a second time in the Senate as part of the impeachment proceeding. And remember that this was after the January 6th event when there was a attempted coup, in essence, an insurrection that the Congress was considering Donald Trump's role in as part of this second impeachment proceeding. And one of the talking points and one of the ideas that came out of this was that a secret ballot might have been useful in helping GOP senators to vote their conscience, more or less. The the Democratic Party, and in particular the House managers of the impeachment proceeding, argued that during the Senate trial, many of the GOP senators were in agreement with the House impeachment team and the managers of the House impeachment uh, process. And Chris Coons was one Democratic senator who agreed with with this idea that GOP senators may have voted a different way. And at first, this might seem unrelated, but it's not unrelated. It's the same issue. It's the issue of voting behavior and how a secret ballot or secrecy changes our behavior by protecting us from intimidation, bribery, fear, or coercion. And let's pause. And I want to actually use this as an opportunity to think about secret ballot and secret voting and what secret voting does in a democracy and how secret voting changes our political behavior. And so we're going to do this by considering a couple different videos and then looking at a question that I have for you, which is, would a secret ballot have made a difference, and why or why not? And so let's just step back for a moment and consider this example, and then we can talk about a secret ballot and we can think about how it might have changed the outcome.
What about a secret ballot? Would there have been 67 votes?
Yes, I'm fairly certain there would have been a vote to convict with a secret ballot. As you just reported on a few moments ago, Mitch McConnell, immediately following this vote, despite voting to acquit on flimsy constitutional grounds, said that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for the assault on the Capitol. And a number of Republicans have already come out and said there should be further accountability, whether through a criminal trial or through some other path towards being barred from office. I frankly think there were a majority of Republicans hanging their hat on a not very compelling constitutional argument, and we need to find a way that we can deliver that accountability. Ultimately, it's in the hands of the American people, but I do think the Republican Party is deeply divided right now, and I'm grateful for the 7 Republican senators and 10 Republican House members.
Let's watch another one here. This is the House impeachment manager, Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett.
Would he be convicted on a secret ballot? Hell yeah, without question. And the Senate would have to agree to that.
Of course they would. That's good to know.
Mm-hmm. I mean, listen, during the trial, as I was speaking, I directed a lot of my questions, the type of words that I use, duty, loyalty to country, love of country, founding fathers, right? That was directed to them.
Right.
And a lot of my focus was on this side where the Senate Republicans were. And I can recall a couple of points in time looking at them and seeing senators nodding in agreement with me, shaking their head in disgust, and even some tearing up. And all of those that I just said did that were not the ones who voted with us. I don't trust them, so it didn't really move me.
Some very candid video there. We appreciate having access to that kind of input. Let's go back to this question. So I'd like to ask you, as a exercise in thinking about the role of secret voting and a secret ballot, would a secret ballot have made a difference in the outcome of the impeachment trial, the second impeachment trial? Why or why not? What do you think? Let's hear from as many people as possible.
I feel like having a constituency means that the decisions you make at that level should be known to the people that you're representing. While I do think it made a difference, I think it's disingenuous to the people of the constituency for the representatives
Okay,
not be able.
but that's a separate question.
Yeah, I know. I just feel like for me it's hard to separate the two. I think to the question that's here, it would make a difference.
Okay, so
Because
that's the key point. So
Yeah.
what difference would it have made?
it would allow people to not have to justify their decisions to their constituencies.
Okay, so if they don't have to justify their decision, let's continue unpacking that. So
Mhm.
so if they don't have to justify it, what does that permit them to do, or why would they vote differently?
Because it would mean that for a lot of the states and or Republican parties of the places that they came from are very pro-Trump. So they could blame it on ex-Republican having voted another way and been like, well, I still support this president and that idea.
Okay. So this is useful because we can peel back the layers of this and think about how the secret ballot might have changed the outcome and why it would have produced a different outcome. Alondra says, yes, there would have been less fear of voting for or against the conviction. Many Republicans and Democrats vote based on how they can stay in office and how to make their constituents and party happy, not what they thought was morally correct. Christopher says, real question, do jury members in real court need to have a transparent vote? I don't actually know that. I can't say with certainty. Arlene says, yes, without having a possible repercussion, people will be more willing to speak without fear. Chandon says, I believe it would have allowed for the participants to freely cast their opinion without the politics affecting them. Jocelyn says, I think so. I feel like people feel obligated to still vote alongside their party, even if they don't agree with them. So, Jocelyn, it sounds like maybe you think that it wouldn't have made a difference if they're still going to vote for their party, even if they can vote secretly. So, obviously, this is a different situation, right? Because there's no landlord or employer sort of controlling the senators or the representatives, but the possibility of a secret ballot would still potentially change the outcome if the reason that those Congress people are voting a certain way is because they fear some sort of consequence or the political consequences of voting a certain way. The secret ballot is what protects them from those consequences, right? If they can't be held liable literally because they can't be identified for having voted a certain way, well, then they can't be held accountable. And so the secret ballot provides anonymity, right? It protects you from negative consequences of any kind because it literally decouples your identity from the vote itself. And so in a very basic sense, a secret ballot is what stands between you and whoever might hold you accountable for the way you voted. And as Ishan points out, there might be a real qualitative difference, right, between a voter voting in a presidential or a legislative election and a senator or a representative, voting in an impeachment trial. And you might, persuasively argue that it should be a public vote when you're voting as a representative, someone who's representing people, as opposed to a private citizen voting in an election. Accepting that, I do think if we put aside that difference, we can see quite clearly the function of the secret ballot, the way in which it provides anonymity and protects the voter from potential repercussions or negative consequences, whatever they might be. This is what the secret ballot does. Virginia has a really interesting comment. Virginia says, I watched both impeachment trials live, and I can say it would have an impact. It would have allowed for some Republicans, not just the few that did stand out without fears of repercussions. Not sure how much impact it would have made, but there would be one, and maybe perhaps we would have seen Mitch McConnell actually vote to convict. It's interesting to note, Virginia, that most of the Republican senators who voted to convict are ones that aren't coming up for re-election. And so that's probably not a coincidence. They don't necessarily stand to be punished for their behavior. And so in that sense, they almost are protected in the same way that they would be if they had a secret ballot. Christopher says the lawyer for either party may ask that the jury be polled, although the request usually comes from the losing party. This means each juror will be asked if he or she agrees with the decision as announced. This is to make sure that the verdict announced is the actual verdict of the jury after the decision is read. So I guess I'm just curious, how does that relate to our question, Christopher?
If you don't have them say their vote out loud and you have it just be a secret ballot vote, then the lawyer would have to compel each and every person to agree, which would take a longer process and would showcase a different side of the case, where basically the losing party, because that's what it says, is it's usually the losing party, would be saying, hey, we want to know who voted against us. We want to know who doesn't agree. And that's putting someone on the spot with their power of attorney.
But that's a legal trial. This is a political trial. So
right, that was my point. It's not like a real trial because it's political.
Okay.
Because real trials, it's more about evidence and adhering to the law, where political trial is more about partisanship and making sure that you take the bacon home to your constituents so they don't, elect someone else.
I don't want us to lose our focus here. So like my question for you then is, so does the secret ballot change
Yes.
the outcome? Okay. So it does change the outcome. Okay. And I think then that the point that is relevant is that the secret ballot actually makes it so that you don't necessarily have to technically represent your constituents, right? Because that's what makes your vote anonymous if you're a congressperson. And so that it's not partisan any longer. And so I think that from the perspective of political trials and political decision making, the secret ballot is clearly an institutional feature of the environment that changes our behavior, or that could potentially change our behavior in a way that would produce a different outcome. So this is a sort of long way of introducing and reintroducing this issue of the secret ballot and how the secret ballot changes voting behavior. Remember that our focus is voting behavior and political behavior, and those voters can be us, or they can be someone casting a vote inside a legislature or inside a party or inside any sort of institutional arrangement or setting that involves the process of voting and counting votes and making decisions based on electoral results. And the politics of voting and open voting is just as interesting. And so we've talked a little bit so far about how the earliest examples of secret voting come from places like Australia and the UK. And in the United Kingdom, throughout the 19th century, there was a lot of complaining about the lack of a secret ballot because it was understood and widely known that powerful landlords and employers mainly controlled and determined electoral outcomes. And the arguments of the reformers were, very, very commonly something like this: the secret ballot will protect against intimidation and bribery. It will protect against fear and coercion determining voting behavior, and it will make it so that people can vote their conscience and they can vote freely, as opposed to, in the interest of someone who controls them or who can penalize them based on how they vote. And in this protection against intimidation and bribery was understood as a very powerful way of ensuring voter autonomy in the freedom and the autonomy of the voter, and so that voting behavior is democratic behavior and behavior that is not controlled or leveraged by some other actor for some other purpose or some other interest. And there were a lot of examples in Europe at the time that seemed to confirm the suspicions of the reformers and the radicals in the UK. So in Germany, for instance, in 1848, when elections were introduced, it took less than a decade before rural voters had largely fallen under the control of landed elites and landed interests who controlled most of the land and the productive assets in the country. And in Germany, it was such a problem that Bismarck even promoted the idea of extending the franchise precisely because he thought that that would offset the influence of the landlords, whose influence was offsetting that of the workers. And so you can begin to see how the politics of voting and the way that voting is done mattered a great deal to the outcomes. And suddenly secret ballots became an important mechanism for ensuring voter autonomy, for preventing the concentration of power in the hands of landed elites and interests, and making sure that the influence of emerging middle classes in particular wasn't diluted and wasn't undermined by the influence of the powerful bourgeois and landed and upper elite classes. And so throughout Europe, the secret ballot was viewed as quite important and was adopted at different times in different places. And the reason that I'm giving you these examples is because in a class on political behavior around the world, we're not just interested in the contemporary period, we're also interested in some of the similarities across time and space between new and old democracies, as you've seen so far in the class. And in this regard, the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, Germany, their experiences are very similar to the experiences of countries like Chile and Uruguay and others, where the secret ballot was adopted much later, but where the secret ballot was equally important to ensuring voter autonomy. And so part of democratic consolidation in these places had to do with advancing voter autonomy via secret ballots, anonymity, and other measures that were designed to protect the freedom to vote one's conscience, as we would say. And so absolutely individual private citizens vote in a way that is different than Congress people, but both cast votes and they have that in common. And the secret ballot at both levels is potentially a mechanism for ensuring anonymity and protecting from intimidation or bribery or coercion or fear or anything else that might influence the vote. Let's watch a quick video that puts this in perspective and talks about how the secret ballot changed the elections in the United Kingdom, and how for the first time the electoral outcomes were viewed and were understood as free and fair and competitively determined.
The Parliamentary and Municipal Elections Act 1872 also known as the Ballot Act, was a major milestone in the development of free and fair elections in the UK. Until 1872, elections took place by way of a show of hands or a public declaration. Such a system was open to intimidation and bribery, as concluded by a House of Commons Select Committee in 1870. In some municipal elections, it reported, many voters would not vote unless paid, sometimes in drink rather than cash, and rioting took place on polling day. The committee recommended instead the secret ballot, along with the closing of public houses on polling days as a way of promoting the tranquility of elections, but also to protect voters from undue influence. The secret ballot had also been one of the main demands of the Chartists in the 1830s and 1840s. Here, at the People's History Museum, as part of the Disrupt Peterloo and Protest exhibition, we can see one of the first ballot boxes ever to be used. This ballot box, now owned by Wakefield Council, was used in the first parliamentary election held after the passing of the Ballot Act in a by-election in Pontefract, West Yorkshire, on the 15th of August 1872. It is made of painted wood and iron alloy and is still marked with the seals used to ensure the votes were not tampered with. The seals were actually made with a licorice stamp, the same used to make Pontefract cakes in a local sweet factory. The Times newspaper reported that the first election under the Ballot Act has been thoroughly peaceful. Persons of great experience declare that they never saw a contested election in which less intoxicating liquor was drunk. No charges of bribery are rife, and the election appears to have been fought on both sides on principles of purity. Hugh Childers, the Liberal Party candidate, was duly elected, and the secret ballot has continued to be a feature of our elections to this day.
So they church it up quite a bit, but the point is relatively straightforward. The introduction of the secret ballot provides anonymity and protects against intimidation and bribery, coercion, and in general, it serves as a sort of firewall between elites and masses, and it protects the freedom to vote one's conscience. And as a result, the first elections in the United Kingdom fought under the auspices of the secret ballot were free and fair and were viewed quite differently than those elections that came before the secret ballot. And so in that regard, it didn't just enhance the freeness and the fairness and the competitiveness of the elections, it also improved satisfaction with democracy and public opinion. And these are all components of political behavior. And so we know then that when people participate in a variety of ways, the secret ballot can also impact their participation in a variety of ways, their opinion of the system or their interpretation of the validity of the outcomes, as well as the way they participate at all. And so this is a way for us to think about the role of the secret ballot. And I want to go into a little bit more detail before introducing the developing world and the new democracies in talking about some of the similarities, but some of the differences between the new and the old democracies. In France, it wasn't until 1913 that secret ballots were introduced. And before then, ballots had marks and they were passed on to notables who could punish the voters for the way they voted in the election. And those notables were, of course, landlords and employers. And they were, of course, the landlords and the employers often of the voters. And so they were very easily able to exact punishment for however a voter cast their vote if they voted in a way that was not in the interest of the landlord or the employer. Of course, even when in France and in Germany secret ballots were adopted, elites and parties still found ways to control voting. And in particular, in Germany, political parties would print their own ballots. And what they would do is they would basically provide the ballots to the voters, because it was from the parties that voters would obtain ballots. Well, when the voters had to obtain ballots from parties, it gave the parties an opportunity to make small changes or mark the ballots in a certain way, so that they could then be distinguished later and matched to the voter or to a class or a group of voters, and that made it easier for notables and for elites and for parties to coordinate and to control votes. The point that I want to make to you is that even under circumstances of secret balloting and secret voting, elites in parties still try desperately to undercut voter autonomy and to undermine open voting and to identify and determine how voters cast their votes so that they can control those votes and determine and shape election outcomes despite secret voting. This raises questions about other mechanisms that might be introduced and how else to ensure voter autonomy. And so these days, secret balloting is only one dimension of approaches to ensuring voter autonomy. There also are emphases placed on mandatory voting, and so requiring everyone to vote so that, for example, parties can't pay people to not vote, which is another way to try to affect election outcomes. Secret balloting combined with mandatory voting, these two mechanisms have been viewed as very effective when combined. We'll talk more about mandatory voting as a potential mechanism to combine with to combine with secret balloting on Friday. But for now, we'll just sort of leave that there, and we'll move on and we'll begin discussing some of the new democracies. And the new democracies, as we already know, have a very different experience. In the first place, they have less experience with democracy and they have less experience with voting. And so naturally, we should expect many countries in the regions of the developing democracies or the new democracies to adopt secret balloting later, and to do so at a time when democracy is being reintroduced, often after long periods of military or authoritarian rule. In the region that presents us with the most conclusive evidence regarding the control of landlords and employers over the votes of their workers and their tenants is Latin America. And in Latin America is regarded as the place where landlords and employers have historically had the most control, mainly because Latin America has the highest level of inequality of any region in the world. The distribution of income and wealth is more unequal in Latin America than anywhere else. And so what that means in practice is you have larger proportions of society that are poor and in smaller proportions that are rich. And that means then that a very small group of elites can often control the votes of peasants and people in the countryside and poor people very effectively, because that narrow group of elites disproportionately controls land and employment. And in a place like Chile, especially, it's a very small group of families that own most of the land and own a lot of the capital. And so what that has meant historically is that there's a lot of power in the hands of a small, narrow group of elites, and they're able to control and supply votes. This at least was the case until 1958 in Chile, and until fairly recently in many Latin American countries. But Latin America, as the most unequal region in the developing world, presents us with a lot of examples of the role and the importance of secret voting, but also the delay in adopting it. So, for instance, Colombia, it has the longest and most experience with formal democracy of any country in Latin America, but it was only in 1990 that the country even adopted secret balloting. Until 1988, there was no legislation on the books that even ensured the anonymity or the secrecy of the ballot. And well, in Colombia, part of the reason was that much of the land was owned by a very narrow slice of elites. And so they had firm control often over the votes of their tenants and those who they employed. And so in Colombia, it both took a long time for secret balloting to be adopted. And in the period of time leading up to the adoption, the electoral outcomes were often shaped relatively decisively by the influence of those elites. And so this helps to explain the power and the influence of conservative parties in a country like Colombia. And in Costa Rica, it wasn't until 1925 that secret balloting was adopted. And in 1925, they began voting in secret. And this is, I believe, a photo from 1991 where the incumbent president is voting. And I don't know if there's anything more Latin American than a desk at a polling place that's tagged with what appears to be graffiti. That is as Latin American as it gets. And I personally love the street art and the graffiti in Latin American cities. But when I saw this, I just had to show you this photo. But as you can see, the vote is secret and it's anonymous. And so those same procedures that we discussed on Monday that we associate with secret voting were adopted in Costa Rica, as in Colombia, and as in many other Latin American countries. But secret voting has been especially important in places like Colombia and Chile because of the radical inequality and the potential for, a very narrow set of elites to basically determine election outcomes. And I want to give you a quote about the case of Chile. And the case of Chile is noteworthy because Chile adopted the secret ballot in 1958, which was fairly early for Latin American countries, especially compared to, say, Colombia, which had a longer experience with democracy, but didn't actually adopt it until much later. On the floor of the Senate in 1958, when the socialist senator Martón addressed the initiative that was being discussed, he said, if that law, the old electoral law without a secret ballot, did not exist, instead of there being 9 socialist senators, there would be 18, and you, the conservatives, would be reduced to 2 or 3. At this point, the conservative senators laughed. And he responded, you laugh, but the truth is that there would be not 2 conservative senators from O'Higgins and Colchagua. And the point of this quote is that, as in Germany, as in England, more than 100 years earlier, election outcomes were largely shaped by the strength of landlords and employers and their capacity to control the votes of their tenants and their workers. And it was so pronounced and so decisive that right-wing parties, conservative parties, were disproportionately represented in the Senate at the time. And as Martón says, as opposed to having 18, you would be reduced to 2 or 3. And this is one example of how the absence of secret voting can help to amplify the representation of parties that don't actually win the election on their own and are only able to get the seats that they get because they sneak in, or because they rig the rules, or because they use coercion to control the votes of those under them. And so this is a story about voter autonomy. And this is a story about, the freedom of voters to vote their conscience and vote in their interest, as opposed to in the interest of their employer or their landlord. When we talk about this, I want to pause and step back here. And I want us to think about why is it that landlords and employers are so scared of their tenants and their workers? Why don't they just let them vote however they would vote? Why is your landlord or your employer so scared of you? Why is this such a big deal? Why do we even need to have secret voting? Who's going to raise taxes, Christopher? Voters will raise taxes? Okay, so do voters and employers or landlords, do they have different interests?
Yeah, I think the reason that people want to control votes is they want to avoid changes to the status quo in ways that wouldn't benefit them. And giving more control to workers inherently increases the chance that changes happen that you don't necessarily as a landlord or an elite like.
Yeah, so the sort of elephant in the room here is the tension between the interests of the workers or the tenants and the landlords and the employers. And sometimes this tension is not totally apparent, right? Sometimes we kind of leave it unsaid. But I want to really focus on this for a moment because you need to understand your power and you need to understand that they are scared of you. If you're like me, you're not an elite. You don't own capital and you don't own land. You're just an ordinary person. Well, as benign as that may seem, you have interests that don't align with those individuals or companies who might hire you or rent an apartment to you. Christopher says, voters might raise taxes on property or business. They may make changes that increase the overhead cost. Ishan says, well, if voters and workers are allowed to run wild, they will make changes to the status quo that take away the benefits enjoyed by those employers and landlords. Well, what kinds of benefits are we talking about? Well, maybe the tax rates, maybe the zoning laws that benefit them and permit them to expand rapidly, maybe various incentives that are set up to promote their investments or protect their investments. Casey says, maybe because landlords, like you mentioned, are small groups of elites compared to the large amount of voters, they need to keep control in some way. Yeah, and they want to keep control because they know that you and I, as ordinary people, would benefit from stuff that those landlords and those employers think that they would have to pay for or believe that they would have to pay for. Here's the thing about elites. They can self-provide. They can self-provide. Back in the old days, in medieval times, elites had their own militaries, they had their own they provided everything, right? They had their own little states, their own little economies. And today it's a little bit different, but still more or less elites can basically self-provide. They can self-provide security, they can buy what they need. And so they don't want to pay more in taxes or contribute to the creation of a system that would require them to pay for those things for other people. Us, we're the other people. We're the ones who aren't able to self-provide. And so we would benefit from paying a little bit more or setting up a system that would help to provide us with the things that we can't provide us ourselves. In that way, we would benefit from setting up more of a state or more of a public sector. The elites would benefit from holding in place the policies that might keep a smaller sector, public sector, or that at a bare minimum would minimize, their obligations. We have interests then that are in tension with one another and that are at odds with one another. And because our interests are at odds, elites want to control your vote, and they want to prevent you from voting, or they want to shape your vote in a certain way. And so when you think about this kind of a issue, maybe it begins to make more sense. Gerrymandering, voter suppression, efforts to close polling places, make it more difficult for college students to cast their vote, to vote in districts different from their home district, to obtain absentee ballots, so on and so forth. There's always this effort to control the vote and to minimize and limit voter autonomy. Can you think of other examples of ways that elites try to control voting? Oh, that's a good example, Christopher. Christopher says, work on election day. Do you know that in most countries of the world, election day is a holiday? I don't know if most, but many. Here in the United States, it's been discussed, it's been floated several times, it's been proposed even. There's been legislation proposed, but it's never ever gotten very far. Why? Well, because elites in the parties that they depend on for support don't want people to be able to vote more easily. They want to control your vote. They want to prevent you from voting. And so they want you to have to work on election day. Ishan says literacy tests, good. Poll taxes, increasing the influence of money in campaigns, totally. Ashley says required voter IDs. Yes, that's one I didn't think of. Alondra says lack of polling stations in lower or more diverse income areas. Yes, we know that there are systematic efforts to take away polling places in minority communities in districts that are districts that are majority minority, but that might go the other way, say might vote for like the Republican Party if they're able to, say, take away some of the voting stations in the minority neighborhoods. And these are all things that have been done. And gerrymandering is maybe the best example, packing and cracking, where you pack certain types of voters, mostly minority voters, into a district so that you can dilute their influence in other districts and prevent them from potentially winning multiple districts. And then cracking, where you break them up across many districts so that they don't win any single districts and their influence is diluted across those various districts. Gerrymandering is one among many examples. Virginia says, I know some current polling places that don't offer ballots in other languages, so that could also be a factor as well. That's shocking to me. I didn't know that that was legal. In India, they have very inclusive rules regarding ballots in languages, and they print the ballots in, I think, like hundreds of languages or something. And I didn't know that in the United States that you don't have to actually provide ballots in a multitude of languages. Listen, everybody, we're going to finish this up on Friday, where we'll go into more detail with the case of Chile. We'll take a look at the period before and after the institution of the secret ballot, and we'll use it as an example of how the secret ballot changes voting behavior and how it can change election results. I'll add one more example before we go. Christopher says Westside Modesto ran out of ballots and turned voters away in the 2020 election. Yeah, that's totally illegal. All right, everybody, thanks so much for being here. I'll see you on Friday. Have a good one.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks, Alondra. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good day.
Thanks, Virginia. You too.